Part 3 of Facts about Princess Beatrice, Queen Victoria's daughter. A mother's worst nightmare. The young princess had to admit that she had consummated the marriage with her husband to her mother when she announced that she was expecting a child. Beatrice had miscarried in the very early months of her marriage, and she was determined not to lose this child too. She therefore reduced her physical activities and social engagements to reduce the risk to her unborn child. But this action led to some very unpleasant consequences, because her mother judged her harshly. Most of the royal household was used to treating Beatrice like a child, but upon hearing the news, Queen Victoria treated her with contempt. Beatrice was still living with Victoria, and so when she was resting during her pregnancy, the Queen would get moody due to her daughter not spending enough time with her. Victoria called her resting moping and boasted that when she was pregnant, I regularly came to dinner, except when I was really unwell, up to the very last day. Beatrice went on to have a royal brood of her own, and that November Beatrice gave birth to a son, the newest heir to the British throne. They named him Alexander, with the nickname Drino. The couple went on to have 3 more children, getting pregnant and giving birth every other year until 1891. Their other children were called Victoria, Leopold and Maurice, but her husband still wanted to abandon her, and in 1895 an old ghost came back to haunt Beatrice. Her husband was back on his quest to join the military, and as he had produced a royal brood of children, he felt even more entitled to it. He had his eye on the Anglo-Asante War in modern-day Ghana, and his request was finally accepted by the Queen, and so Beatrice had a long goodbye ahead of her. In December of that year, Beatrice waved goodbye to her beloved Henry as he went off to fight for Queen and country. After only a couple of weeks, the fatal truth that Victoria had previously envisioned came true, and Henry died. He had contracted a deadly case of malaria. They sent him home to be with his family, but he did not make it back alive, because her husband had died a horrible death. Beatrice had heard the news that her husband was sick, and she was relieved that he would be coming home. But what happened next she did not expect. She went to meet the boat back from Africa, but when she expected to see her husband, she was instead greeted with a telegram telling her the news of her husband's death. Beatrice was understandably heartbroken. She had grown up in a household full of grief, and so she did what she knew best. She grieved for the Prince Henry, who she would never see again, and she withdrew from the court, and she refused to take part in many aspects of her life. She began to neglect her family just like her mother once did with their family. The Queen surprisingly attempted to cheer her daughter up, and she organised for her to have a dark room for her hobby in photography. But this gesture was not enough to pull her out from despair. The princess was unwilling to drag herself out of mourning, and this led to a breakdown of her relationship with her own children. History was repeating itself again through the generations. The children began acting out in school, with her daughter becoming troublesome and rebellious, and her eldest son Alexander telling unwarrantable truths. After all of the heartache that she had experienced in her life, she completely lost her purpose. On January the 22nd, 1901, Beatrice's life changed forever. This was the day that her mother died, ending the Victorian age, and leaving her free of her mother's influence for the first time. Ironically, her mother died on the 5th anniversary of the day she had learned of her husband's death, which led to a double dose of heartbreak. Not only this, but she also then began to have sibling rivalry, and when her mother died, she fell out of favour in the court, as she was not in a privileged position as she was previously. There was a giant gap in the ages between King Edward VII and Beatrice, which led to a relationship or bond never really forming. When Edward created his inner circle, Beatrice was completely omitted from it. She had completely fallen out of place in the hierarchy of the royal family, and she went on to make a huge mistake in the eyes of her brother. As the sister of the new king, she was still expected to act in the correct manner and attend all official events. One of the most important events she was invited to was the coronation of her brother as king. She had become clumsy during the service, and she dropped her prayer book, taking the attention completely away from the new king and putting it onto her, and this absolutely infuriated her royal brother. So he went on to betray her. Beatrice and her husband had spent the majority of their marriage at Osborne House, and it was her mother's favourite home and also her place of death. Edward, however, wanted to sell it, much to her dismay, but she begged her brother not to, and only partially succeeded, with the king extending the grounds for her own Osborne cottage. She knew Queen Victoria's deepest thoughts though, and after Victoria passed away, Beatrice, as her secretary, was responsible for transcribing and editing the Queen's lengthy and detailed diaries for posterity and publication. There were hundreds of volumes, and Victoria did not leave out any details, and she covered her candid opinions on both her family and her country. So Beatrice took it upon herself to censor her mother. As her mother's closest confidant, she knew of her desire for privacy, and so Beatrice opted to remove enormous parts of her Victoria's memories. She reduced the hundreds of journals to just 111 volumes, and that took a whopping 30 years to complete. Beatrice's nephew, the future King George V, despised what his aunt was doing to his grandmother's legacy, but no one could stop her because she knew a big secret. The Queen deeply mourned the loss of her husband, Albert, for years, but it is rumoured that she did eventually find happiness again in the comfort of the arms of her Scottish personal attendant, John Brown. We may never know for sure due to Beatrice removing much of her mother's journal entries, and so there is no proof of an affair. The Queen, however, was buried with a lock of his hair, which would be a very unusual thing for a colleague to do, unless there was more to it. Sadly, Beatrice's later years provided very little happiness. Her children were becoming part of the reason for her to be unhappy. Her daughter married Alfonso XIII of Spain, and she had climbed high up the hierarchical ladder. But this marriage led to disaster, and Beatrice spent many times consoling her upset daughter when she returned back to England on many occasions. Beatrice was to suffer even more heartbreak when her son repeated history. In 1914, Beatrice saw the outbreak of World War I, and history repeated itself in the life of her son. He joined the military in his father's footsteps, and just like she had also had decades before, Beatrice stayed home and prayed for her young son's safety. Once again, history repeated itself to horrible effect, and she lost her favourite child. World War I only began in the late July of 1914, but Prince Maurice was killed in action before the year was even up. He was caught up in a shell explosion while leading his men across a ridge. He was only 23 years old, and Beatrice was completely devastated yet again by the loss in her life. She once again withdrew from public court after losing her youngest son. She carried the royal disease. The royal family was plagued with a blood clotting disorder passed down by Queen Victoria. The royal disease was a dangerous and often fatal disorder called haemophilia, and it spread all across Europe through the many marriages that Victoria made. Both the Queen and Beatrice were carriers of the disorder, and the evidence of this came to light the hard way. In 1922, Her son Leopold needed knee surgery, but as a haemophiliac whose blood could not clot, he died at only 32 years old. In the end, Beatrice endured long past so many of the people that she loved. She even outlived her nephew, King George, and publicly laid wreaths in memory of him. She only passed on October the 26th, 1944, at the ripe old age of 87. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. Please comment, like and subscribe if you wish for more stories, and leave your suggestions below and I will endeavour to cover them.